Hello, welcome back to the Agent of History podcast. Whether you're watching it on YouTube or listening to it as a podcast, welcome back to this journey. This is a journey of exploration into these two questions of how did we break and how do we heal. And here I'm interviewing people I call guides who can help us explore the terrain that we need to explore in order to uncover and develop answers to these two questions. And I'm really honoured and excited to introduce today's guide, who is Michael Roberts. Now, I don't really read many blogs, but I read Michael's religiously and have done for quite many years now. I find it an invaluable resource to help me understand what's going on in the global economy and the global political economy. So Michael, to introduce him, Michael worked in the City of London in investment banks as an economist, as an analyst for over 40 years. During that time, was able to closely observe the machinations of global capitalism from within the dragon's den. At the same time, he was a political activist in the labour movement for decades, and since retiring, his writing has flourished through the production of several books: The Great Recession, a Marxist view, published in 2009, The Long Depression of 2016, and Marx 200, a review of Marx's economics, that was published in 2018. He also works closely with Italian Marxist economist Guglielmo Carchedi as co-editor of World in Crisis, and has published numerous papers in various academic economic journals and articles in leftist publications. And above all, he blogs at the nextrecession.wordpress.com, and I'll put the link in the text, and check it out. It's an absolutely indispensable blog. So check out what Michael Roberts has to share in answering these two questions from a Marxist or historical materialist perspective on how do we break and how do we heal. Michael, thank you so much for joining me on this Agent of History podcast. Real honour. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joel, for inviting me. I hope this will be interest and use for anybody who watches and listens.
I'm really confident it will be. I'm very excited to have this conversation. To get things started, this is a journey of exploration into these two questions of how did we break and how do we heal. So how would a Marxist approach, or obviously there are many types of Marxists, but how would you as a Marxist begin to take that question on of how did we break?
Well, I think the biggest contribution that a Marxist analysis or perspective on human civilization is to consider the development of humanity and its organization, social organization, through what Marxists would call the materialist conception of history. So if there's been a break, if humans are broken up, human society is broken, it's not because of evil people, bad and good, fighting each other, or evil men at the top having bad ideas. We have to look much more closely at what is going on at the economic and social foundations of human organization. So a materialist conception of history says that in a way, once we got beyond the very early stages of human civilization in terms of hunter-gathering, people staying in communities together in order to get enough food and survive the day and continue the next day and so on, a very basic level of survival. Once we got beyond that and we moved to societies where people farmed, where they produced enough food that was in surplus above what they needed on a daily basis in order to reproduce. Once we developed a surplus, then the situation began to change, because then we had a beginning of what we would call a class struggle between those who wanted to control the surplus and those who were forced, if they didn't have any surplus, to work for the others. So we begin to develop classes. That's one of the fundamental ideas that a Marxist perspective of history of humanity has. A class society begins to develop. It takes different forms. It could take the form of a slave society where the controllers of the surplus are getting that surplus of actually owning people, controlling their lives completely. So these people just have to do what the owners or their owners tell them to do. Or a feudal or serf society where people are forced to work so many hours or so many days on the Lord's land, amassed a few days on their own land to survive. But basically, the surplus is delivered to the Lord. They don't do any work. The serfs do that for them, and they're forced to stay in that landed property under the control of the Lord and even fight for them in wars and so on. But the modern human organization, which has developed in the last, say, 250 years or so to become dominant globally now, is what Marxists would call a capitalist society, where the mode of production has changed. It's not the ownership of slaves for the surplus controllers or the controllers of serfs for the surplus controllers. It is now a situation where all the means of production, that is the factories, the offices, the money and everything, is controlled by a tiny elite, and everybody else, in us, most of us, everybody here, 98% is probably the latest empirical estimate, have to work for a living. Only 2% of the world's population, adult population, are in a position where they don't have to work for a living. They get income from rent, from profit and interest. The rest of us have to work for a living, even if we've got stocks and shares. We couldn't live on those. So the world has now been divided into two classes, if you like: the class of owners of the means of production and those who have to only own their labour power, their ability to work. And that division of society is now the dominant way of organising production. And it's produced the most extreme inequalities and, as we know, increasingly grotesque breakup, not only of human society, but of the planet itself, as we developed the dangers from global warming and the environmental degeneration that's going on because of the drive of the owners of capital to get more and more profit, more and more surplus out of the rest.
Yeah, there's so many questions coming to my mind, but I think, well, one is you know that Marx's great masterpiece, Capital. It's called Capital, so I wonder why then it's called Capital rather than Capitalism. And maybe you answer that, because I know that your answer will touch on the nature of the relational, and the stories that we're told about the origins of capitalism are very much told because capitalism is such founded on such an individualism, that they're told about individual stories about lazy men and rich and hardworking men, and there's a kind of there has to be a story that justifies this inequality. But actually, I wonder why you see it that Marx called the book Capital rather than Capitalism or capitalists.
I think what Marx wanted to use the word capital as the title of his major work, as you say, because he wanted to show that this was a different mode of production, in the sense that what is happening here in modern economies and societies is that it is the domination of the owners of the means of production and their ability to put to work everybody else in a relationship which appears to be fair. You get a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, but in reality you work more hours in labor hour terms than you actually get in wages in labor hour terms. So there's a surplus created, and you don't see that surplus being created. It's hidden into the prices of commodities, and it's incorporated and accumulated in what Marx called capital, which takes different forms in the circulation in an economy. It takes the form of money, takes the form of products, machinery and so on, takes the form of labour power, our power to work, and it also takes the form of the commodities that are produced and sold and that we consume. So there's a circulation going on from money to make more money. So that is the concept that he wanted to present to us as capital. It's a relationship between capital and labour, but capital is the dominant force. By the way, Joel, he had a subtitle which was a critique of political economy. In other words, that's what that subtitle said. Well, look, other economists before me, other social analysts before me, in particular the classical economists of that time, had started to analyse this nature of this capitalist society. He used the word capitalism a couple of times, really at all. And but they didn't, while they grasped that there was a process of production based on labour time, based on people working, and that decided what something was worth, how many hours had been put into it, they didn't recognise and weren't prepared to recognise that it was an exploitative process between those who own capital and those who only own their labour power. And that, therefore, you wanted to criticise their inability to recognise the real nature of the modern economy, which he called capital. So it's two things. One, Marx wanted to explain how this particular form of exploitation, we talked about the others, slave society, feudal society, Asian absolutism is another, this particular form, capitalism, how it works, and also to criticize previous economists who weren't prepared to recognize its workings properly at all.
Yeah, it's very much the first time. Well, there were these people who would try to take David Ricardo and kind of turn him upside down to show it from the workers' perspective. But Marx was really the first person to systematize that like so comprehensively.
Of course, everybody disagrees with this, Joel. Everybody disagrees with Marx. Nobody accepts this idea that modern economies are an exploitative society based on the exploitation of labour power. This is the Marxist law of value, that we're exploited, labour exploited, their ability to work is exploited to produce more surplus, to sell on the market, to make profit, so that money makes more money. That is Marx's explanation of capitalist economy. Modern mainstream economists disagree entirely. They don't see it that way at all. The word profit does not enter their vocabulary. It's a very important point. If you look in the newspapers about economics and so on, yes, you get about huge profits of individual companies and so on, but nobody ever says that this is a profit-making system designed to make profits at the expense of others. That's never said by mainstream economists.
No, well, okay. Well, while we're on this, then I think it's really important to say, and when I was, it's a big learning point for me that to understand the origins of economics as a discipline in the late 19th century, in the context, obviously, of a very maturing society of industrialization, urbanization, and proletarianization, and therefore an emerging increasingly strong and coherent and collectively organized working class. That's when you find the creation of economics by people like Stanley Jevons and Walras and Pareto, and they're all doing exactly. They're all trying. Well, there is a famous quote from Jevons that says, "Let's just drop the political in political economy. Let's just call this economics." Yes. So it was absolute conscious effort to say, no. There's nothing to see behind the factory door. What Marx famously called the hidden abode. And actually, we could also. Maybe there's room in this discussion to talk about what Nancy Fraser calls the other hidden abodes, which is the hidden abode of the household where all of the social reproduction is done, and the hidden abode of the ecological sphere, of course, upon which capital accumulation depends. But taking it back, economics was an absolutely conscious political effort to depoliticize, to say no, nothing to see behind the factory door. It's all in the noisy bustle of the marketplace, where supply and demand is carried out through the magic of this mechanism, the market, that takes selfish individual interests and converts them into the optimal social benefit. So, yeah, I think it's important just to kind of emphasize the origins of economics in that way. But now I'm on your territory.
Yes, well, maybe you want to go back to yours.
Well, no, but yeah. So if we did take a step back, because this question is how did we break? Obviously, as you say, now we're talking about a system on a planetary scale. That although it's still it's breaking down, areas of life that are not controlled by commodity production. It is on a planetary scale now. So the question then is, how did that happen? What was that historical process? And maybe you can answer that question with in the context of this word freedom, because obviously so hegemonic and central to our language, our political language, our social language that dominates our culture is this language of freedom. we were speaking earlier together about the
Yeah.
limits of real freedom in our society, and then we were talking about how the peasants had to be freed up to create the labor force to be exploited in this particular way. So yeah, maybe we could talk about
Yeah.
that historical process briefly, so we can
Well,
really answer this question of how did we break.
let's say first of all that Marx and Engels stood for the idea of we need to take humanity into the realm of freedom. That was the objective. If you want to talk about people talk about socialism and communism, what does that mean? Well, one of the things it means is the freeing up of humanity to be able to create, to be able to express themselves, to develop their consciousness about the world and their planet and so on, to express everything they can and have the time to do that and the freedom to do that, freedom from toil, freedom from having to work uh, globally at very hard level, a very low level of satisfaction and income from that, to free people, free humanity. Marx was saying we can do this. It is possible if we have a system which is organised through commonly, organised cooperatively, using the technology and resources of the planet in a humane and ecological way too. Then we're in a position to establish freedom. So that in a way, you could see the break as being has to be healed by reaching the point of freedom for everybody. But the break has come through a desperate struggle to improve the levels of freedom that people have. And now we look at the world now of 7.9 billion people. Uh, Two-thirds, at least two-thirds, probably more, have no freedom in that sense whatsoever. They don't even have the very basic freedoms that we consider in the so-called West as being a demonstration of how free and democratic we are. They don't. Many countries don't have the right to vote. Many countries don't have the position where people can go on the streets and protest, or they can even write anything that they want to write or say and talk about like we're doing now. They don't have that right. That is crushed. And even in the countries like the so-called West, where we have the opportunity once every 4 or 5 years to cast a vote for uh, parties that basically say we're not going to change anything. And we have some limited rights to strike if we don't like what our boss is doing, but even then it's restricted. And we have some other rights to go and protest, but even then the police will close you down sometimes. So we have even those rights, even those democratic freedoms that we've established in the West are very, very limited to what humanity should be able to achieve. And most important, Joel, those freedoms, those rights that we've got have had to be fought for over centuries, often in major struggles to get the right to vote, to get the right to protest, to get the right to organise a trade union or some organisation which is against the interests of the status quo and the ruling elite. So we have not got very far down the road towards freedom for humanity. And that's Marxism starts with the view that that is our objective, and also to add that it is possible, particularly now we have the technical resources, not only to get freedom for humanity, but also to do it in a harmonious relationship with nature as well. It's possible, but it does mean a complete transformation of the way we organise our social and economic structures at the moment and end this class society and this controlled by just a small elite.
Absolutely, and we'll move on. We'll absolutely in the second half kind of really move on to consider how we do that. And we're not gonna nail that one definitively, but we'll have a look at it. But two things. So first, this historical process. Marx does talk about how people had to be freed from their feudal chains, and then but there's this ironic sense of the word freedom, because in order to be a worker, to be a proletarian, you have to be freed of everything apart from your labor power. In other words, you have nothing left. You can't, if you have a choice, an option to subsist on your land, then you're not fully immersed within the capitalist economy. And so you have to be freed of everything apart from the one commodity you have left to sell, which you can reproduce, which is your labour power. And that's obviously the experience of the vast majority of humanity. If they're lucky enough, there's that old Marxist joke, which is the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited.
Yes.
So, it's obviously...
What you're talking about, Joel, is that Marx was making the point that we have free labour now. People, as you say, people are free to decide whether they're going to work and who they're going to work for. Of course, this is a joke. It's not a freedom. We have to work because we have to make a living. We have to provide for our families, or all of us do, and we have to just provide for ourselves. We have to look after our children if we have children, and so on, or our older relatives if we have them. Whatever limited support is given by society as a whole is limited. We have to work. It's not a question of having the freedom to work. But as you say, actually, capitalism started by driving off serfs and peasants from the land by enclosures, by force, and in the case of the third world or the rest of the world, or what we call global south now, by occupation and colonial suppression of the populations there, and the establishment of the extraction of their resources and their labour power in slave labour situations almost. And of course we know about the slave traffic, which was a massive part of the creation of a huge amount of surplus for the emerging capitalist powers, particularly in Europe to begin with, and later on the United States and so on, that these countries got a huge, or the owners of production in those countries got a huge surplus by the extraction of that surplus from the colonial peoples around the world. So what Marx called this primitive accumulation, it wasn't the process, as we see, of employing labour, getting a profit out of labour and selling a commodity. It was by a forcible robbery process of extracting surplus from people to get capitalism going, if you like. It gave it the surplus to begin the process of capitalism. But now in modern capitalism, we still have this extractive process. Imperialism has replaced colonialism, if you like. Modern imperialism means that the big multinational companies in the major economies occupy the productive processes in countries all around the world, expand industrial farming, energy production, mining, technology, and so on. And in conjunction with the domestic capitalists of those countries, they extract huge amounts of surplus out of the poorest peoples in the world and transfer that through trade and through capital and financial flows back to the imperialist countries. So in many ways, the primitive accumulation that began capitalism is now being extended by the imperialist extraction of surplus value from the rest of the world. So capitalism is got a little bit weaker in the advanced countries, and it's compensated for that by the imperialist operations around the world. So the expansion of capitalism now throughout the world, virtually there's no area that you could talk where capitalism is not now the dominant mode of production, has also meant that there's an increasing inequality between just a small number of countries and the rest. And that's one of the results of this process of capital accumulation.
What would you say to maybe people listening who were feminists or more or ecologists who their primary political concern or their primary thirst for social or for justice in the world, it takes the expression of gender justice or ecological justice. And I know there's a very rich tradition of ecological Marxism. I've done an interview with Professor Jason Moore, and that's coming out very soon. And feminist Marxists. But what would you say to feminists or ecologists who aren't familiar with Marx's work at all and say, well, I'm not particularly interested in that because that's about class, and that doesn't speak to what precedes class, or even racial justice for that matter. I'm thinking about what Marx had to say about slavery. What would you say to those people?
Well, let me just do a few one-liners from Marx. He said, The working class is not going to emancipate itself unless we also emancipate those people who are being racially discriminated against, black and other ethnic communities. And also, the working class is not going to emancipate itself unless we also emancipate working women in society. It's not a question of either or. We cannot achieve a better society with full freedoms unless we also emancipate, women are able to emancipate themselves as well, and the black and other racial societies and groups in society who are heavily oppressed, and so not only in the countries of the West, but of course internationally, unless we can change that position. But how do we? How do we do that? It seems to me that it's a question of that class isn't irrelevant. That it is class organisation and struggle that brings that possibility about. That we know, for example, that one of the key ways that capital exploits working people is not the fact that they force them to have to go to work to make a living, but also we as working class people have to pay for looking after our own houses and basically and our households and all the conditions there. That means basically up to now, working women, they may have to go to work and they have to do for nothing all the household chores, all the chores of childcare and so on, and that applies across the board. So to reproduce the labour power that capital wants to continue is done at the expense of working people, not at the expense of capital. They get that for free. They get the surplus for free, and they get the reproductive maintenance, if you like, for free as well. That's something that has to be transformed in a new society. It should not be the case. I mean, during the COVID slump, when many millions have been staying at home and not going to work and so on, the pressure upon, it seems to me, in the household is increased for those who have to do the household duties, and that is predominantly women most of the time. And we can't, that demonstrates to me that unless we have a cooperative way of organising things, so that we have proper childcare, we have proper facilities for children to be supported, so that everybody can equally participate in looking after their families and reproducing and opening up an area of freedom which still doesn't exist. Freedom for people to go and do what they want and still be able to be sure that their children are okay and protected and developed. We don't have that, and capital doesn't want to pay for that. And we have to change the system, create a system where we can do that cooperatively.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, another question that I think would be important to put to you is the why, and I really want to explore this more deeply over the coming years. But what would you say it was about or is about capitalism that has enabled it to become the dominant, hegemonic planetary system by which essentially all life is now reproduced, according to its logic and needs. All life is now reproduced. What is it about capital? What is it about humanity? What was it? What's your take on that?
Well, I think that what Marx and Engels did in the Communist Manifesto, which I had the viewers to read if they haven't read it. I'm sure they might have done, but then read it again because every paragraph has got something to tell you. And one of the things it's got to tell you almost at the beginning is to explain the power of the increase in productive forces, to use a Marxist phrase, which basically just means that humanity can produce more things and services that we need than we had before in the same amount of time. There's a big increase in the productive forces, the technology, and all those things available. And that's been achieved by capitalism because capitalism got rid of an agricultural-based society and in search for profit found ways in which to try and reduce the cost of labour. So it started to introduce all sorts of machinery to replace labour and just using more and more workers, more and more people. It got machines that could produce more with a smaller amount of workers and so on. Of course, then we are now dominated by the machine, as Marx said. We're at the mercy of capital and the ownership of machinery, but machinery produces a pile more things. And also that there was a drive to get machinery means that you drive to look for scientific solutions to technological problems. And one of the biggest solutions that has come about under capitalism is the expansion of trying to make the workforce healthier. So life expectancy has dramatically increased. Why? Actually, mainly through public works, not through capitalist activity, things like public health, irrigation, sewage, all that sort of health. Vaccination is a classic example now as the product of public works using science to develop society as a whole. But the drive for profit means the drive for better technology in order to reduce the labor cost and increase the profit. And that has mean it's just a dynamically powerful system in terms of productivity. And that's the first half of Communist Manifesto. That's what they're saying. There's lots of praises about capitalism's ability to take us out of the misery of what existed before. But we now have a new misery because the contradiction between that is a massive increase in technology and productivity of labour, the raising to some extent of living standards around the world, but massively increased inequality, severe degradation of nature, now the threat, an existential threat to the whole planet as a result of this progress. So the contradictions haven't disappeared. They're different now, and in many ways worse as a result of capitalism. But one of the things capitalism did do was take the productive forces so far forward compared to any previous system. Well, I was looking at the data the other day. If you look at just take one measure, which is the productivity of labour, the amount of output produced per worker historically. And if you look at it from about 1,000 up to now, 20,000, for 1,000 up to about 1,550, it's flat. There's hardly any move in the productivity of labour. And then with the emergence early on of capitalism, you begin to get a bit of a rise in the 16th and 17th centuries. And then, of course, from the late 18th and into the 19th century, a dramatic rise in the productivity of labour. And no other social system has been so staggering in what it's done. But it's produced these extreme contradictions as a result, because we still don't have a harmonious and cooperative way of organising humanity for the benefit of all.
Yeah, and I think the key word there is that would bring us on to talking about your work, particularly in relation to crisis, is contradiction, and that again, people might not know that Marx, as a young man, was studying and growing up in the shadow or in the light of Hegel, the great philosopher of the first half of the 19th century. In Germany, but Hegel was an idealist, which means that he understood that history was, or he proposed that history was unfolding through what he called Geist, which can be translated as spirit or mind, and that it was a dialectical idea, which basically means that you have like a dominant idea that's in a particular social order, and that idea comes to be challenged by its thesis, is challenged by the antithesis, and in that struggle a new synthesis comes, a new thesis comes, and that's what's driving, that's what the motor of history is. Whereas Marx then turned that on its head and actually, as you said, proposed a materialist concept with history, where the driving force are not ideas in this abstract way, but the material, the social relations of production between classes in human society. So what's my point?
Crisis, you were going to say.
So the contradiction is, so this is the point. The key point is, rather than framing capital as this all-powerful, totalizing, unstoppable force, there are and many authors. David Harvey has wrote a brilliant book on pointing out these fundamental structural contradictions within capitalism that create antagonisms, that create above all crises. So it's not just a case of it's not just a case that people, the workers around the world have to unite to overcome capital. Capital also has these inherent contradictions that lead it time and again to periods of profound, and now today maybe possibly terminal, who knows, but one could make that argument that a situation of terminal crisis. So maybe we could talk about Marxist theory of crisis as you understand it, because that is a very hotly contested area of Marx's philosophy and theory. And what does that mean for capitalism today, as you see it? So two questions there. What is crisis, and how does it come about within capitalism? And what are we looking at today if we apply Marx and your own work to the contemporary situation?
Well, Joel, at the end of the book I wrote called The Long Depression in 2016, well, I made 2 points at the end of the book. I said there are two Achilles heels. We talk about the Achilles heel, but two heels that Achilles had that capitalism has weakness. The first is that it has internal contradictions that cannot be resolved without replacing the system altogether. That's the first thing, which is, as you say, the upside down position of Hegel, where you have contradiction in the mind leads to a new idea, if you like, or a new approach. Marx and Engels said it's not a question of a contradiction in the mind. Those contradictions in the mind express the contradictions that exist in human organization and society. That's why people's ideas change, because the situation changes. As Marx said, men make their own history, but they only make it within the circumstances in which they're placed. They can't make something which doesn't already exist. They have to work from that. And the changes that are taking place in our economic and social structure change the way people think, both the ruling classes and any classes opposing them. But the contradictions exist within the capitalist economic system. That was the first Achilles heel. The other Achilles heel is that the very development of capitalism leads, as we've just discussed before, between a small minority that own the means of production and everybody else that doesn't and has to sell their labor. So we create what Marx called the proletariat, or the working class around the world, and it's now the dominant class of the world. The peasants are no longer the dominant class. People live in cities. People generally work for a living. They don't sit on farms producing things. That's now a small minority in most countries, and even in the most backward countries, it's not the majority anymore. So you're in a position where we've got this huge working class around the world of billions on the one hand, and a small group of people owning everything. That's what Marx predicted would happen, and that is a threat to the very existence of the system, because all those working people have no objective interest in preserving the position of the ownership of capital for a small minority. But the first Achilles heel is that there are actually contradictions in the capitalist system itself, that capitalism cannot progress the productive forces, which we talked about before, indefinitely, in a harmonious way that recreates everything that to create enough things that people need that they can get. We can see that there's poverty around the world, it's massive. We can see there's inequality, but also that we can see that on a regular basis, this capitalist system goes into an unexplainable or inexplicable slump, crash, where production stops, people are told they haven't got the jobs anymore, companies close down, banks crash, as we saw in 2008-9, and for some reason, this perfect system, which we're told by mainstream economists and the rulers of our society, the best possible system of all best possible worlds, goes into these terrible slumps. 2008 was a terrible slump. And there have been many before, nearly every 8 to 10 years, of varying degrees of intensity since as far back as you can go, to 1825. So there's clearly something wrong with the way in which the capitalist system of production works that creates this contradiction. Now, there are many different theories for this explanation. First of all, just to say that mainstream theory denies this. They say that it doesn't really happen. These things are either accidents, mistakes by individual politicians or economic policy decisions, and can be easily corrected. Other economists have different reasons about why they think these crises take place. And even within the Marxist economic sphere, we don't agree on what is the reason for these crises on a regular and recurring basis. Everybody more or less admits outside of the mainstream that there are regular and recurring crises, and they do appear to be the result of the structure of capitalism. But there's a difference of opinion about what actually in the structure of capitalism causes that. We could go on all day about the differences. I'll briefly say that there are perhaps 2 or 3 main arguments. The first one is that the reason why there are crises is because workers are never paid enough in their wages to buy all the goods that the capitalists are continually producing. There's an over surplus, an overproduction of goods, and therefore the position develops where there's a lack of demand for the goods that capitalists are producing. They just produce them without thinking about it, and the result is that there's a slump when all these goods can't be sold.
So just to make that really concrete, one obvious contradiction is that we are employed. You're employed by a firm as a worker to produce a commodity, and at the same time you are also required to be a consumer to purchase those commodities. So the capitalist wants to minimize her or his costs by reducing your wages as much as possible. But the more they reduce your wages, they reduce your spending power to purchase the commodities. And obviously, over the last 40 plus years with stagnating wages, credit has become a big part of trying to keep it going. But as you say, that leads to what is impossible outside of Marxist economics, which the Keynesian also, but in mainstream economics, which is an overproduction, which is lack of demand, which is not even kind of factored in mainstream theory. So I just want to add that. So that's the first one, is it? So the possibility and the actuality.
I would make a critique of that theory, but what it leaves out is, of course, that capitalists are not just selling to workers; they are also selling to other capitalists. So a large proportion of the demand the capitalists can sell. A steel company does not sell me a bar of steel. So there are lots of products capitalists are producing, whether it's barrels of oil, which I don't take home with me. They are selling them to other capitalists. The capitalists then do something with that, convert that into commodity using labour power, which they may sell to another capitalist, and so on. So there's a whole intermediate bunch of products being produced, and that's where the missing demand is often taken up. Marx explains actually in volume 2 of Capital that you can see that capitalists sell to workers, but they also sell to other capitalists. So there's a balance there so you don't necessarily have to have a lack of demand. So while there's almost certainly will be times when there's a lack of demand because it's anarchic in capitalism. Things are not planned properly. We don't know what all these individual decisions of capitalists will lead to, an uncertainty, and particularly if there's a credit crunch where people don't have enough money to carry through what they had planned, so you can have a financial crash. So there's always that danger. But it doesn't really explain, in my view anyway, a regular recurring crisis in capitalism. It just tells you that capitalism is not a stable system. But it's possible to be stable, at least theoretically, because they can sell to other capitalists. So that's one theory. Another theory is that capitalism is financially unstable. We're now in a financial world where decisions are made by banks and by shadowy type banks, where financialization is the phrase used modernly, that now it's no longer production to produce things that people actually need, real things, and proper investment. It's all a game of casinos in the financial sector, and this is totally unstable and reckless and without regulation, and this produces crashes in the financial sector, which leads to crashes in the rest of the economy. And this is true. These things happen. But again, my criticism of that would be it doesn't really explain regular and recurring crises, because I can think of periods, certainly say before the Second World War and even up until the 1970s, when the financial sector wasn't a big sector of the capitalist economy. But did we not have slumps then? We did. We had them on a regular and recurring basis. So there's got to be a different reason, a more fundamentally underlying reason why there are regular and recurring crises, which can be triggered by financial crisis, or can be triggered by some lack of demand, like a COVID slump or something. So, but what is that? What is that underlying process? That's my view. But I have to say, and I'll tell you what it is, and it remains, I would say, probably a minority view amongst Marxists who prefer the other two explanations that I presented to you up to now. But the view is that what we need to look at is what is going on with the profitability of capitalist production. Capitalism is about production for profit, so it is what is the profitability. If profitability is doing well, if capitalists are making a lot of profit out of production, they'll invest, they'll employ more workers, boom takes place. But what appears to happen is that they can't sustain that level of profitability. Wait a moment, the viewer might say, well, what about Amazon? What about, Microsoft? What about Apple? They're all making huge amounts of money. Sure, that's nonsense, isn't it? When they're always making more profit. No, it's not the case. If we look at the data and we take the average for everybody, all the companies in the big economies, and for that matter of the world, we find that in their drive to get more profit, they tend to invest more and more in machinery, means production, technology, and less in labour. And Marx's argument is, well, actually, the profit only comes from labour. So if you reduce the amount of labour relatively, not necessarily absolutely, you will get relatively less profit out of all that investment in machinery you're taking place. So there's a tendency for the profitability of capital to fall over time. And when it comes down, not in a straight line, not like a cliff, there are things that counteract that can reverse the tendency and lead to a rise in the rate of profit. I've got time to go into that in detail, but there are periods when there are.
Oh, just one. I mean, we could just say one. I mean, if you're able to, if wheat prices fall dramatically and the price of bread can be reduced, or the basket of staples that can keep workers going can be reduced, then that could be a counterweight to that falling.
Yeah, and also if you raise the productivity of labour in general by using new technology, then you can raise the total amount of value that's being produced. And so if you can, as you say, also that means that the wages you have to pay out in value terms will be less because the productivity has risen. But also you can cheapen technology. The computer cost £100,000 a big mainframe 30 years ago. Now we're talking on two little laptops or whatever, tiny things which do it way more powerful and way more ability to produce and way cheaper, so we can reduce the cost of technology as well. There are factors that counteract this tendency, but overall there is tendency for profitability to fall. And it's not just a tendency. In fact, it does fall, and when it falls to a certain point where profits no longer grow sufficiently for capitalists to consider worth investing, they stop investing. There's a slump, and we get layoff of workers, closing down the factories and so on. And then when enough is closed down and enough people are laid off and the costs are reduced, those who survive, the bigger capitalists actually, are then able to get a higher profitability because they've taken the place of the weaker ones. And then we have a new boom again. So we get this cycle of boom and slump based on what's happening to profitability. That's my argument. I think that's more related to, I think closest to what Marx would say, because it's a profit-making economy. It's not a finance-making economy. It's not an economy that's trying to gets into trouble with demand. It's a profit-making economy, and that's what decides this regular and recurring crisis. That view is highly debatable. All I would say, it's in Marx's Capital, Volume 3. There's a debate amongst Marxists about whether it should be in Volume 3. Their argument being that Marx didn't believe it anymore and Engels should have taken it out because he edited it. But I won't get into all these intricacies that Marxists argue about. It's a bit like looking at the interpreting different versions of the Gospel of the Bible here. All I would say is that we have to look at what's happening in reality and say we have crises under capitalism. Capitalism doesn't move smoothly. It gets into crises, which leaves millions of people out of work, millions of people without living standards on a regular basis. It tries to overcome this in many ways. Crises themselves overcome it by laying a new condition for growth, often by war as well. War can create the conditions where capitalists can suddenly take a leap forward or at least the winners can, as a result of that. So there are ways of overcoming this contradiction, but it doesn't go away. That's the point. The contradiction is there. It's here now in 2021, and down the road there will be another slump. I will predict that to the viewers now. And while we have capitalism, there will be another slump in the next 5, 6, 8, 9. I don't know exactly when. I try to analyze it on a daily basis, if you like, on my blog to analyze what's going on. But it will happen again, and things have not resolved. I mean, we talk there's talk now. Oh, the recovery's here, boom is here. We're all going to be back to normal, and in fact, it will be even better than before. Is a lot of the talk in the papers now. That may be briefly, but these underlying contradictions don't go away in the actual structure of capitalism. And that is why capitalism is a system that cannot last forever. It's if you were to read the ruling class's view, capitalism has always been here, which is nonsense because we know about feudalism, slave society. Capitalism has always been here. And anyway, now it is here. It's the best possible system, and nothing can ever replace it. This is it. This is how it's going to be forever. We're going to organise on the basis of a small group of people making huge profits and handing out what they like to the rest of them. That's the system for humanity, for the eternal future, let alone for nature. What does that mean for nature? But for humanity, that's it. It's it. As we were talking at the beginning, that's it. That's the amount of freedoms we've got. One vote every 5 years, and that's it. That's our future, or our children's future, or our grandchildren's future. Surely not.
Well, it is, this insistence on the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama famously put it. Yeah, I'm struck because there was, I think it's legislation now that, I don't know if it's legislation, I think it must be legislation, that the government basically now has insisted that schools cannot, so they teach, about extremism, and the one new element now, it's in the definition of extremism, is any ideology that advocates the abolishing or the transcending of capitalism. You cannot speak about that in schools now. And it struck me the other day with my 9-year-old son, who was he was talking with his friend about a poster they were doing about biodiversity.
Mm-hmm.
And this incongruity of being talking about learning about biodiversity and why we need biodiversity, but not being able to talk about the system that is murdering biodiversity and will terminate biodiversity. So, but that suggests to me that whilst the Telegraph and the Mail might be saying one thing, then secretively they might be a little more concerned about the future. So I wonder if we could talk about that, because it seems to me, not least from reading your blog and also obviously the name of your 2016 book, The Long Depression, that and not just that, just the high priest of the system itself, whether it's the IMF or current or former heads of the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England or whoever it may be, they're all worried. They all can't see sources of serious structural revival for capital and its profitability. So how do you see it? Yeah, that's a big question.
How do I see what's going to happen?
I'm not asking you to. But what I'm talking about is how profound. Okay, let me put this in a more concrete way. How profound is the crisis of profitability for capital right now as a system that it can continue, even in the medium term?
Well, if we, the measures that I and others have made about the profitability of capital, both in the major economies and even globally, and so far as we can develop the statistical data, we try to do it scientifically and using the evidence. That's as in all cases with science, everybody argues about whether you've done it properly or not. But there you are. The evidence shows that we are probably in the major economies, major capitalist economies, we're at a very historically low level of profitability. So Marxist law of the tendency of the rate of profitable appears to be has happened. We are much lower level of profitability than we were in 1855 or in 1955. So it's all go ups and down over that period, but the profitability is near an historic low. probably out of a slump. It's now going to rise a bit because we'll see closures of weaker companies and people won't go get all their jobs back. So costs will be reduced for the capitalists, especially the bigger ones, and they'll do a bit of investment. We'll get some sort of growth and profitability will rise to some extent. But the trend is still going downwards. Now, somebody once said to me, well, if the trend is going downwards, is it going to go to zero? I mean, is that the end of capitalism when it gets to zero? Well, the answer to that, of course, is we can extrapolate if our figures are right. And I can tell you that assuming that nothing happens at all to reverse the trend, it would go to zero about 2075 or 2085. But of course, that's not what's going to happen. There's going to be a series of slumps which will drive the profitability up again for a while, and there could be other developments that counteract that. So it's a bit like a horizon that you never get to. It's going to be there, but it's not exponentially going to be there. There's continual changes in the process, but it demonstrates, what that demonstrates is that capitalism doesn't have an unending lease of life. It is increasingly more difficult for the capitalists to expand productive forces because it's increasingly more difficult for them to raise the level of profitability, because that's why they do it. They don't make things, provide services, capitalists, unless they make a profit. And if that's increasingly difficult over time, over decades, over years, then it'll be more and more difficult for them to meet the product, to boost living standards and help people. Productivity growth, for example, which is a very good measure of the development of productive forces, growth has been slowing in all the major economies for the last 35 years. It's slowing. It's going down. It's now where it used to be 3 or 4% a year. Now it's under 1 or 2% or below. So it's crawling along the development of the productive forces, particularly in the major economies. Some of the big emerging economies are doing a little better because they've got a lot of catch up. But on the whole, that's the picture. So capitalism is not going forward in the great exciting way that some people used to think. Certainly when I was a young man like you, Joel, in the 60s, we're in the golden age it used to be. But the golden age when there was virtually full employment, not only in the major economies, not in the colonial world, which was hell, but in the major economies, there was full employment, good investment, profitability was high, we had a welfare state, unions could organise, the golden age. But that's an exception in capitalism. It's never going to come back. It's not going to come back again. When I listen to a lot of Keynesians who argue, well, we need to get back to the golden age when the government used to manage the economy to make sure there was no lack of demand. It's not coming back. No government's going to be able to manage the capitalist economy to provide a welfare state and provide full employment anymore. It's not there because the profitability for capitalism is no longer there to provide the support for that. And if workers want to get concessions out of the capitalists, they're probably going to force them into a crisis. That's the situation that we're in now. So the prospects for capitalism over the next generation are far worse than they were over the last generation. That means we may be in a depressed situation now where there doesn't seem to be much action on the part of the second Achilles heel, namely the proletariat, at least in the advanced capitalist countries. Globally, that may be different, but in the advanced capitalist countries, there doesn't seem to be action, not much strikes, not much struggle. But if capitalism creates even later any conditions by which workers feel more confident about their position and can organise, and there's whole layers of new workers in new industries that have hardly been touched. They're not talking about coal miners anymore. We're talking about software engineers. We're talking about technology people in this area. These are the areas, new areas, which are untouched by struggle yet, but will well be the forces of struggle in the future. So the second Achilles heel is going to play a role over the next generation. I'm confident that we will see further attempts, as we've seen in the history of the development of the working class, to try and change this system for the better for us all, not just in the major economies, but also, of course, in what we like to call the global south now.
Yeah, I agree. There's one thing that might challenge you a bit on, which is this, say like software engineers. Actually, that's a really interesting area because you have this kind of what they call like an ecology around the major Silicon Valley giants. And of course, those companies generally, obviously, don't like to employ, as like to keep to a minimum the amount of people they actually employ on good,
Yeah.
secure contracts. And so you have this ecology of kind of freelancers, gig economy,
Yeah.
but highly qualified, and
Yeah.
so engineers and
So that the working workforce is atomized, really, isn't it? It's atomized into small
yeah, but it
groups
is,
or
but
individuals. Yeah. Yeah.
it is, but there is where you find actually, the vanguard
Yeah.
of a movement that is around open source and a recommoning
Yes.
of the
Yes.
virtual commons,
Yeah.
and what Mackenzie Ward called the hacker class, coming into a sort of kind of class consciousness. So it's really interesting to see. It's a very beautiful community that is really committed to what extent, the consciousness of what they do. There's some literature on that, but there's certainly a great drive of commoning, of cooperation there, of social
Yeah.
cooperation. It's very heartening. But I wondered, to finish it off, maybe
Yeah.
from your perspective, we just had, I think it was the 100th anniversary of the death of Rosa Luxemburg, the
Uh-huh.
great Jewish German revolutionary and Marxist, whose probably most famous maxim is socialism or barbarism.
Yes.
And you've kind of intimated this already. Like, there is no return to any notion of a middle ground of like the social democracy that we had, in that those post-war decades. So, assuming that it sounds like maybe that capital's crisis is so moribund that and we've seen this already, that it seeks to maintain itself through a lurch to barbarism, through a lurch to evoking and provoking the ugly
Yeah.
and hateful and malign elements within us, within our humanity. So what does the socialism look like? That's a big question. But in your view, what does it look like in
Yeah. Well, the first thing to say is I think that Luxemburg is right. That the, some people say, "Oh, Marxism sort of teleology. It's just determinist. It says after capitalism comes socialism, and it's just a process, inevitable process." No, it's men make their own history, and it's not inevitable. As Rosa Luxemburg said, that there is a serious possibility that if capitalism breaks down to the point of not even being able to function in an effective way for billions of people, it doesn't mean that socialism would follow. What happens if the working class fails to organise politically or any other way to transform society? What will happen is what you say. We will descend into barbarism in the sense that we will have fascist leaders. We will have a breakup of society of reactionary forces, which could destroy the planet. Nobody's going to use a nuclear bomb on another country at the moment because it's not in the interest of the majority of the ruling elite to do that. It's bad for business. But it's possible for some lunatics, if they come to power on the basis of reactionary forces, to consider that. And as we're already beginning to see, failure of capitalism to deal with the climate change is an indication of their inability to deal with something that threatens their operations, let alone the rest of us. So there is a danger of.
Yeah, I was going to add the example of Bolsonaro. I mean, Bolsonaro is a fascist leader who's destroying the Amazon and all of the peoples within it. It's not hypothetical. This is
No,
actually
it's not
happening.
hypothetical, and also therefore it shows Marxists are not determinists. It is an open question which way it will go. All that was Marxism says is this capitalist system is not going to deliver what people think it's going to deliver, and it's getting more and more difficult for it to deliver. Therefore, the contradictions that we talked about are going to intensify, and which way it goes is still an open question. Will humanity be here at the end of this century or not? I mean, it's an open question. at least in the form of the millions that we see it now, however bad that is. So it's still an open question. What's the good answer? What's the socialism answer which you raised? Well, what we want is a society where the resources, nature's resources, human labour resources, our knowledge, our education, our skills, our technology is combined on a worldwide basis in a common ownership and cooperatively produced, because we produce cooperatively. We don't really do things on an individual basis. You might say, well, I'm sitting at home on a computer and I'm doing it all on my own. No, you're not. Somebody built the computer. Somebody's got the internet connection. You've got all kinds of other media operations that require knowledge for you. No, everything is cooperative. If everything is cooperatively organized and produced, why shouldn't it not be cooperatively owned and controlled by everybody through democratic process, through planning of everything? Big companies plan what they're going to do. Big companies like Amazon plan everything internally. There's no market inside Amazon. There's no pricing going on, although sometimes they try to set up pricing systems, cost systems in, but it's a planned system. Amazon's board and management are deciding how much they're going to produce, where they're going to build their new plants and so on the basis of a plan. Why can't we organize the world's resources on a plan, rather than leaving it to the anarchic decisions of a bunch of small multinationals decide within the interest of their profit, rather than the interests of people as a whole? That's the sort of economy that we want. How do we get such an economy that begins to allow people to get the resources they need on the basis of what they need and can be achieved, and therefore freeing them up, who have freedom at the beginning to be real human beings? How can we get that? Well, it requires a replacement of the capitalist system. How is that possible? Well, it will require political action, political struggle to achieve that. I don't know whether that's going to be achieved. I can't say whether we can do that. All I can say is that we have examples in history of capitalism where working people in the early stages of capitalism and later on have struggled to change the system for the better. So far, capitalism dominates, and these attempts, on the whole, have failed. They have failed. They've failed to really transform the world economy. Two things then, I'll finish with this. It requires working class action, and it requires international action. It's not a question of one country. You have to start somewhere, but it can't be resolved unless we have a world government, if you like, a democratic world government where the whole of the world is involved. Obviously not in a big centralized way, but in a sort of decentralized, organized way to use the world's resources in a harmonious way. That would solve the problem of climate change 100 times quicker than it's happening now. Would end the degeneration of the environment 100 times quicker, rather than 100 times going towards the degeneration at the moment, if we had such an organization of society. And it will be a transformation of humanity. Finally, the world will be organized together on a cooperative, democratic basis to harmoniously develop society and move towards human freedom, instead of the nightmare of classes and class struggle that we've had for the majority of human civilization up to now. When I say human civilization, I mean when humanity started to organize some sort of social structure beyond the very early stages of hunters and gatherers. We end the class society and we move to a classless society where we use the resources of the world and ourselves for the benefit of all.
Well, what a beautiful way to wrap it up, because we began by saying how we broke through the beginning of history, as it were, history being the history of class struggle and all of the breaking and the violence that has entailed. And we end with saying, well, actually, we heal through the end of history, as it were, the end of class society in all its forms, in the capitalist form today. And it takes a form of socialism. What that exactly looks like, of course, is for us all to decide. I think this is also, just finally say, is that this is why I love reading your work, because I know that on one level it can be, dry economic analysis, but really at the heart of it and at the heart of you is a passion for human freedom and for justice, and that's really what it's all about. So thank you for everything you do in that regard.
And thank you, Joel, for inviting me to allow myself to express this view.
No problem. Okay, well, keep up the great work, and I'll link to your blog, which is at the nextrecession.com, and it's an invaluable read. So, yeah. Thanks, Michael, and
And
take
thank
care.
you. Bye.